Good morning. So I am so delighted to have Stephen Wolfram here. You know, it's one of the great things about my job is, you know, over the years I've been able to follow a lot of terrific people. And one of my favorite, and I've been following him for quite a while, is Stephen here. And it's always fantastic to check in with him because he's always doing something amazing. He's always ahead of the curve there. So please welcome Stephen. Hi. Now, we're going to talk about, among other things, health technology, personal analytics. But before we do that, Stephen, you know, in case you don't know much about him, has just done, among other things, three really big significant things. One is Mathematica, the software platform, the company he's CEO of. Another is a groundbreaking book called A New Kind of Science, which is self-descriptive, and like a third is Wolfram Alpha. And to me, the glue of all these things is a sense that the universe can be computed, and that through computation we can understand the universe and ourselves maybe. So do you want to, before we get into the specifics, just say something about that as a backdrop to what we'll talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've spent the most of my adult life kind of trying to take seriously this idea of computation. I mean, I'm kind of convinced that if you look at the history of the last century or so, the sort of single most important thing that's emerged is this idea of computation. And we kind of know this as a practical matter. You know, we have computers are doing all kinds of things in our world, but I think this sort of fundamental concept of computation, we're only just starting to see kind of the significance of that idea. And this is about questions like, imagine all possible computer programs. What's this universe, what's this computational universe of possible programs? What do they all do? Are they the kinds of things that are going on, for example, in biology, or in physics for that matter? When we look at kind of the knowledge that exists in the world, how much of it can be made computable? That's what I've been interested in with Wolfram Alpha, trying to take kind of all the knowledge that our civilization has accumulated and trying to set it up so that if there's a question that can be answered on the basis of that knowledge, it becomes automatic to be able to answer that question by using computation. So I think and I'm also kind of suspect that the way that sort of technology is going to evolve, what we do today, where we have engineers try to actually invent technology sort of step by step as humans, that's going to be the minority thing that happens. The majority thing that happens will be more kind of searching this computational universe of possibilities, making use of sort of all the things that become possible through computation. So I think this is, we're sort of just in the very early stages of seeing what happens with this.
Okay, and speaking of exploring, the computational, results, the stuff that we generate there. Recently, you've posted some amazing blog posts about your personal analytics, and that's sort of a leitmotif of this conference here. I think at one point you claimed you were the most data-collected human on the planet here.
That's my
probably some people who will take you on here. I know you told me not to say this.
I'm hoping that.
Yeah.
Right. No,
to talk a little bit about your personal, analytics here.
Well, so I'm a data-oriented guy, and so I kind of have just sort of routinely collected lots of data about myself. Mostly, I don't know. I suppose we can show you if this works. Might be able to even show you something. Let's see what we can find here. See, I have to do this live on an actual computer because otherwise it's no fun at all.
But that's the real Stephen Wolfram. You banging away at the computer. And
yes. That's what I do. That's what I spend my life doing.
As we'll learn, yeah.
Right. So this is sort of some basic piece of data. This is a dot for every piece of email that I've sent in the last 23 years.
What's the shift in 2002? What does that mean?
That was me finishing my 10.5-year effort on my book, A New Kind of Science.
Mm-hmm.
I saw you right at the time when that shift was happening.
And you immediately stopped sending emails.
No, that was the big white part is when I was asleep and not sending email. But you learn. So I learned that I went very nocturnal when I was deep in working on this basic science project. And you can learn all kinds of things. I learned all sorts of things about, oh, I don't know, that's keystrokes that I've typed on my computer, recorded those for a long time. And you can kind of get a little bit of somewhere here. Yeah, there's the kind of, there's my daily rhythm as a function of time of day. So you see, you know, there's some outgoing email distribution. I'm probably most productive late at night. I'm not at all productive, not really properly awake usually at this time of the morning.
So we're a blip on this screen
yes,
here,
yes,
right?
That's right. This will show up as a little blip, and it'll probably have some little tail of higher or lower productivity. I'll find out.
And this thing on the bottom is steps. What, you know?
Yeah, it's just measured from a digital pedometer. I've been doing that for a few years. That's me trying to, you know, very habitually take a certain amount of exercise every day.
At a midnight, right?
No. That's
noon. I see.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
That's first thing in the day.
So right after this, you're going to start bounding up and
yeah, I should.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And to wrap up the analytics thing, you also did one about Facebook use. What led you to do that, to help people analyze their Facebook activity? And I'm just curious about the feedback you've gotten and what people.
Right. I mean, so you know, the thing that this kind of thing of you know, I've been keeping all this data about myself for a long time. As a practical matter, while I've been doing it, the main thing that I found particularly useful is just having my computer send me email the day after telling me, you know, you typed this number of keystrokes or you walked this distance or whatever else. And that's been a useful way for me to kind of keep my life organized. I suppose for me, probably the number one issue is I work on these very large projects. They involve lots of other people. They're never-ending projects. Something like Mathematica, I started it 26 years ago now, and it's still growing and prospering today. And one of the challenges for somebody like me is to get completely you know, submerged by large projects that one has already done and never to be able to do anything new. And so my sort of main mechanism for trying to do new things is sort of keep as organized as possible in what I try to do. And that's how I came to sort of collect all this data and so on. But most people have not can't go back in one can't go back in a time machine and start collecting this data, and the systems are not super easy to set up.
Well,
so
more and more, I would think that we're in that state there. You know, that people do more and more things that are measured. You know.
Yes, this is true. And you know, one place where people are leaving sort of a digital engram of themselves is in things like Facebook. And so we wanted to see what would happen if we just connect. If we just sort of you know, take people's Facebook data and try and analyze it. So with our Wolfram Alpha system, we've been particularly concentrating on sort of ingesting public knowledge in the world. But one of the newer activities with Wolfram Alpha is letting people upload data of their own, whether it's kind of numerical, textual data, or whether it's image data or whatever else. One form of data that they can now upload is connecting to the Facebook API and uploading their Facebook data. So my particular Facebook account is kind of boring because I really don't pay any attention to Facebook. But you can see a few things here. I mean, you can see things about people who commented on posts of mine, things like that. Someplace down here you might be able to see, let's see, oh, you know, genders of friends, age distribution of my friends, together with some people who I don't believe are really 107 years old, but that's what they tell Facebook. You know, there's the geographic distribution. There are things about, oh, look at that, people's birthdays. Larry Smarr's birthday today, interesting.
Right.
You know, who the most common first names are and things. And then this is the kind of the social graph. Mine, honestly, is pretty boring and just shows that pretty much very few of the people who friended me know each other because they're all kind of just people out there in the world. For other people, these kinds of graphs tend to tell pretty interesting stories, and that there's, I don't know, this is just a smaller graph for me where you can see a few clusters starting to develop, and people, you know, people seem to tell us every time I sort of talk to somebody about this, they look at this and they look at it for, you know, for 15 minutes or something, and they start saying, well, that's the group of people that I knew at this, you know, in high school, or that's the group of people that were in this town, and so on. It tells a story. And I think what would be really interesting to see is the time series of the development of these kinds of social graphs, which I think will tell one quite a bit about sort of how one is developing socially, so to speak. Perhaps, you know, oh my gosh, I'm getting really depressed, I'm closing in, you know, my whole network, all these kinds of things.
Could you use Wolfram Alpha as sort of a nexus where you can get multiple feeds in from, you know, not only from Facebook and other social networks, but mix it with all other sorts of information? So you want Wolfram Alpha to be sort of our go-to point for our analytical analysis?
That's the idea. Okay. I mean, one of the things that's pretty interesting is being able to mix kind of your personal data with general public knowledge about the world. So, you know, being able to know, I don't know whether it knows it for me, but if I was younger, it would probably be able to tell me what the weather was like the day I was born, and, you know, all these kinds of things that make use of sort of public information in the world. I think that's sort of our goal in general, is to have this sort of connections hub that allows one to take data from, you know, APIs, sensors, all kinds of things like this. We're sort of we're lucky in that Mathematica gets used by sort of a decent swath of the world's R&D folk, and we've sort of been forced to support all these hundreds of different data formats for all kinds of things. So it's kind of free for us to be able to ingest all kinds of data and be able to analyze it and so on.
Okay, so one thing I know we want to talk about, you wanted to talk about today, is diagnosis there, you know, and how this technology might radically change the way our ailments are diagnosed there. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So I mean, we've
I know
been,
you do. Yeah.
There's sort of a question of, you know, as you try and automate things. I've spent lots of my life trying to automate different kinds of activities and trying to make them computational, so to speak. Medical diagnosis is pretty hard for humans. It's not obvious that it's really should be that hard for computers. The question is, how can one set about dealing with that kind of thing? Well, you know, in Wolfram Alpha, we have all sorts of public health data. You know, if you type in something like, you know, HDL, male, age, you know, 48 or something, it'll just be slicing down some public health data and showing us, you know, the distribution for people in that gender and age and so on. Or we could go and we could start asking it questions about, you know, I don't know, let's say sore throat plus cough or something. See what it says here. And it'll probably be able to tell us, it recognizes those as symptoms, good sign, and now it will use some public health database to try and say, well, how many people per year have presented themselves to doctors with those characteristics? How does that vary with age? Things like this. This is all fairly basic, and I don't think yet all that useful. The question is, can we do something much better than this, where we can actually enter sort of symptoms in an organized way and sort of automate the process of giving us a diagnosis? I think the answer is yes, and I think there are several different sources that we'll use for this, from sort of traditional medical diagnosis flowcharts to sort of the 3 million papers in the medical literature, to the kinds of data that we're getting from sensors and so on. And, you know, this whole question about what happens with medical diagnosis, I think it's inevitable that the practice of medical diagnosis has to change, because right now, you know, you might say, well, you know, somebody looks pale today or something like that, but that's something that in the future it's going to be more, there's this 10 megabyte time series of you know, what the pigmentation of your skin has been based on some sensor. And then the question is, how do you deal with that? How do you reason with that? How do you handle that? How do you get deduction from that? And I think that's something that's going to force sort of the process of diagnosis to become much more computational and algorithmic. And we're trying to figure out how best to do those kinds of things.
Is part of this an integration of sort of an expert systems approach, where you would get some sort of core dump of actual doctors or things like that? Or do you think that's probably too sloppy and you want to
No, I think the only thing, look, one has to know what's really out there in the natural world, so to speak. You know, you've actually got to get large chunks of medical data, analyze them, try and digest from them these kinds of you know, probabilities, sequences of things, and so on. I mean, we've done a certain amount of work on this, and it's actually shocking how good you can do, how well you can do with really simplistic kinds of mathematical models.
When you say you've done some work with that, what have you done? Tell me. What?
A variety of projects where we're using healthcare data from groups that we've worked with, typically groups that want custom versions of Wolfram Alpha to be built for their healthcare data, and so we've ended up getting to see some interesting, fairly large data sets that are not publicly available, and be able to do some experiments with them.
So have you been doing diagnostics with that? Have you been diagnosing?
No, not really. I mean, that's more just being able to do things like predict, given that there's been a series of diagnosis codes that have been seen, what will be seen in the future, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Which is not yet the sort of the fine version of diagnosis that I think is possible. I think.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, I mean, you know, one question is what, you know, you think about medical diagnosis. One of the things about medical diagnosis that's a little disappointing in a sense is, you know, how does one actually classify diseases? You know, there are all these fine, you know, ICD-9, ICD-10, all these fine classifications of diseases, but it's a little bit unclear from a basic science point of view. I think a little bit about, you know, well, how should we really think about diseases and you know, how to sort of give an ontology of them and so on. And I've kind of been interested in an analogy for human disease, which is what one might call software disease. You know, you think about a computer, it's running its operating system, you know, things over the course of time, sort of crud builds up in the operating system, things get slow, it starts to malfunction in various ways, and eventually splat, you know, it crashes, it dies. Then you get to restart it again, sort of from the same genetic material in the next generation of the, you know, the next run of your operating system or whatever. So I've been sort of thinking about, you know, how do you diagnose software problems? And you know, there's no ICD-9, ICD-10 for software. It's kind of, you know, there's no kind of, you know, Merck manual with, you know, diseases of the display subsystem and so on. That's you know, that's not been created. Sometimes tech support groups have things a bit like that, but they're very primitive even compared to human medical diagnosis. And so, you know, one of the things we've been interested in actually is the question of when you look at a large software system and you see it running, what can you measure about it that's kind of an indication of its health? Right? I mean, it's like you go measure its blood pressure or something like this. What's the, you know, you can measure very, very coarse things like memory usage, things like this. But the question is, you know, with a software system, you can actually go in and see every single bit in the software system in principle. It's much easier than for, you know, for human medicine in today's world. And, you know, what do you measure? We don't yet know the answer to this, but it's an interesting sort of thought experiment. One of the things you realize from thinking about this is, yes, you can sort of put diseases, software diseases, into various kinds of buckets, but there's a tremendous fine structure in what's happening inside these buckets, and it's not the case that you can sort of say, from the point of view of how you should treat the thing, it's not obvious that you know, the bucket may be too big to be able to specify how to treat it. I think it's the same thing, you know, you see in biomedicine. People say, oh, well, there's just this one kind of cell that does such and such a thing. Well, it's studied a bit more. Well, actually, no, there's 5 different variants. Well, actually, no, it's even more complicated than that. And it reminds me greatly of a lot of basic science that I've done where one looks at sort of all possible programs for things, where one looks at sort of simple programs. I don't know, I've got to bring up my all-time favorite, probably.
There we go.
This is a typical example of a very, very simple program that has the feature that if you run it just starting from a single black cell, it does very complicated kinds of things. If you change the program just a tiny bit, it does very different kinds of things. My guess is that what's happening here is very similar to what's happening when you see all these different kinds of immune system cells or something like that in the body, that each different kind of cell is effectively running a slightly different program. The results of those programs are very different to
So actually, that might lead you to something pessimistic in terms about treating diseases there. If every disease, you know, turns out to get its own level of complexity there, we might find, these amazing cures we would hope for to be sort of elusive.
Well, I think that what it tells one is you have to be algorithmic about the whole thing. You have to be able to simulate things. You have to be able to. You're not necessarily going to find this sort of one global thing. It also suggests that when you start thinking about things like drugs, today's drugs tend to be just, I find this site, I bind to it, I make something happen. Drugs in the future one can expect to be much more computational, to be actually little molecular computers. That
what would a computational drug be like?
It would be a universal platform, just like for computers. And there was a time when computers, there was a time before people understood about universal computation when people said, I've got an adding machine. No, I've got a square root machine here. They're all different machines. And then people realized that it was possible to make a single universal computer that you could just make do all these different things by pure programming. The same kind of thing, I think, is going to happen for molecules. And it's going to be the case that not only can you sort of change what the molecule does, you can also have it make decisions about what to do based on kind of its environment, not unlike what biology itself manages to do. But that means that you get to have a much greater variation in the types of things that you can do, and it doesn't. And then the question is, well, what should you make this molecule do? How can you actually have some better outcome for this process that's running and so on? And then you have to start thinking about doing modeling and simulation and so on.
Well, from a clinical model, then, what do you envision, our diagnosis and treatment to be like if you extend this vision, like a decade or two out? What's going to happen? How am I going to find out what's wrong with me? How am I going to treat it? How much is it going to be me and my sensors and my computer? And is my doctor a genius bar now? I mean, how's that work?
Well, I think my guess is that people will sort of watch their health in a way that's a little closer to the way that they watch sort of financial portfolios and things than
that's
what happens
alarming.
now. Yeah, right. But so what happens in finance, for example, you can say, well, there are these symptoms of what's going on with some stock. It has some wiggle that looks like this. If you're a technical trader, you say, well, that wiggle looks like a head and shoulders effect or something like this. And then you say, well, given that, well, I should buy, sell, whatever I should do. But in fact, we know that in the finance area, it's much more, given this particular behavior, we have some algorithm, the algorithm decides what to do, and we go on from there. My guess is that in sort of the medical world, it will be much more like that. There'll be a lot of sensor data that's coming in. You'll see all these curves. There'll be all sorts of detailed effects in those curves, some of which you'll be able to describe in some sort of easy linguistic way, others of which are just, well, it's a wiggle in the curve, and there's nothing particularly to call it. The thing that, and then what will happen is there's both a certain amount of human, looking at these curves that will happen, just like there is in financial kinds of things. But there's also potentially lots of algorithms that you get to use to decide what to do. So I'm guessing it will be sort of sensors in, algorithms to decide what to do, potentially algorithmic drugs and various kinds of algorithmically oriented medical devices. Actually.
Right. So I'm all connected, and I get my diagnosis. My MakerBot concocts me a computational drug, and I'm good.
Well, right. So there's some basic science to figure out before we can do that. I mean, one of the things that's one of the things that came out of the basic science that I spent a lot of time thinking about is, you look at a picture like this and you say, well, what will happen a million steps from now? How can you figure out what's going to happen? You might say, it's sort of the traditional science is all about doing predictions. You might say, well, let's just use science to make a prediction of what's going to happen. Turns out you can show that's not in general possible. There's this thing I call computational irreducibility that makes it be the case that there's no way to know what's going to happen other than essentially to simulate each step. Computational irreducibility bites us in understanding things about fundamental theory of physics and so on. I think it's going to bite us in medicine too, and we're going to end up finding out that in many cases we can't sort of immediately predict what's going to happen. We're going to actually have to follow through these steps to work it out, and then we're going to have to start enumerating, here are some possible interventions that we can make, what are the effects of these different interventions, and it's going to be a very sort of computational process.
Okay, great. We have time for maybe just one or two questions here. I don't see anything from Twitter, and there's a hands there. Maybe the mic can reach you there.
So thank you very much, very insightful. What about if we had a tool that would be called a virtual human? And because diagnosis and treatment, this is about big data, and in this virtual human, it would be open source, and you would capture, retrieve, navigate, and visualize all data that people are posting there. And it would be Google-like, Google Earth-like, where you can zoom in and out, and you can post pictures, and there you diagnose. So this is all based on data are put into context and lead to information and then to knowledge. So what about a project like this? So you could do this with the NIH together with Google, with Wikipedia Medicine. So it's
he might want to do it with Bing. This is his partner for.
I'm not quite sure what at the level of sort of the map of the human, actually in Wolfram Alpha, very soon there'll be data that's derived from the Visible Human Project, and you'll be able to sort of ask linguistically things like, what bones does this nerve go closest to, and things like that. But in terms of being able to take large amounts of sort of crowdsourced data from people about their medical states and diagnoses and sensor results and so on. Yes, I fully expect that there'll be, and perhaps people here are going to create the great version of this, sort of a mechanism a platform for bringing all this kind of data in. With Wolfram Alpha and so on, what we hope to do is to provide a good analytics system to sort of underlie that. Actually, we have a data repository that we're building primarily for researchers, where people can publish data that has been set up to be understandable, so to speak. Data that's been ingested and put into a form where you can actually ask questions from it and so on.
Okay, so one final question.
Hi, thank you for this. So a lot of the conversation has been around really sort of focused on the individual person and what tracking or all of the information could tell us. From a public health perspective, we think a lot more about communities, populations, that there are external factors that influence your health as well as all that, your genome and whatnot. And so how would you sort of comment on what the Wolfram Alpha or all the work that you're doing, sort of how does it sort of intersect with this public health, with the external as well? And can we use these systems in that genre?
Well, I mean, with Wolfram Alpha, we sort of have coming in, I think, more feeds of data about different kinds of things that have been sort of successfully computationally understood than people have ever had before. So whether it's earthquakes or climate or whatever else is going on, we know lots about the world. How one tries, and we don't yet know things like who's getting sick where and what's we only have data from the CDC and things like that. We don't have more detailed kinds of data. It will be very interesting to be able to get sort of more crowdsourced data about those kinds of things, and then to be able to correlate it with other things that we know about in the world. I think we're in a good position to do those kinds of things. It's not something we've done yet. Clearly, also there's another dimension, which is being able to capture social network data from things like Facebook, correlating that with kind of public health kinds of issues. This is all very interesting stuff. We look forward to providing a good platform to make things like that possible.
Great. Well, thank you. Fascinating as I had hoped.